The first formal union on the railways was founded by an Irishman born and raised in India named J.B. Miller. In fact, if you talk to these people, it was precisely the moments of intense repression where there was greatest solidarity. So Ziad didn't kill the unions. He did not kill the spirit of trade
Yes.
unionism. That's not true.
Hello and welcome to New Wave History. I'm delighted that Dr. Ahmed Azhar, who is an assistant professor at IBA Karachi, he's joined us. He is a PhD in history from Germany and also holds an MA from SOAS in the UK. And Dr. Azhar's research concerns trade unionism, labor rights, etc., in the historical context. And we're going to have a discussion looking back at the past as to how the trade union movement evolved in Pakistan, in particular Lahore, where that's his area of specialization, but overall, and how it has declined and faded over the recent decades, and what are the implications for that. Welcome, Dr. Azhar. Thank you for joining us. And let's begin with your work. How come you selected this area of investigation for your research?
Thank you for having me on your podcast. Okay, so this is research that I did as part of my PhD. It culminated in a monograph that was published by Orient Black Swan in India. Um so I started this research because I was hoping to find a working class that was very militant, that was very class conscious. I had a certain understanding of what that meant, which was completely shattered as I went along. I figured that I would look at this proletarian vanguard. These
Hmm.
were workers in the railway workshops, blue collar workers in the tens of thousands. And during the late colonial period, they mounted a very strong attack on the state and as well as the broader system that it had brought about.
Right.
I was hoping to chart a narrative of gradually, sort of increasing class consciousness amongst this working class, and expected to see it in certain stages, as we are generally taught to do. Those of us who approach these questions from a leftist framework, at least from a Marxist perspective. So, trade unionism was never supposed to be the focus of my investigation. Uh, just the way it is for my teachers and for others who are involved in left politics, trade unionism tends to be a stage in the journey to class consciousness.
Yes.
And at its worst, it is supposed to detract from that ultimate goal of achieving a revolutionary class
Mhm.
consciousness. And I had begun in that same vein. But as I looked at the movement, the labor movement closely, as I tried to listen to the people involved in it, the leaders as well as the rank and file, I realized that trade unionism, in order to understand it on its own terms, in terms that could make any meaning for those actors, I had to dispense with that entire baggage that I was carrying. So trade unionism was not some stage in the journey for many of these people. Trade unionism, in fact, became for them the realization of proletarian brotherhood. So just
Right.
the act of organizing a union, mobilizing workers, voicing their demands to authorities that had been completely negligent or deaf, was something that was very revolutionary for many of these people. And
Right.
um, and this trade unionism was derided then by the left, the extreme left.
Hmm.
They argued that this is a union that has been taken over by reformists, and they have their stranglehold on these workers, and they won't allow them to develop into purely and militant sort of a working class. So what I discovered was that the people who made this union, who ran this union from the 1920s to the 1940s, they did not identify themselves as reformists. They were, in fact, quite opposed to this tag. They proposed a different name for themselves. They wanted to be called genuine trade unionists. And for that 20-year period, their union remained unrecognized. So during that
Right,
period,
right,
the railway authorities could decide, and in this case, the railways and the state were one and the same, of course. So they could decide which union to recognize. They never recognized Miller's Union except for a very brief period in the early 20s. And then by 1925, they had propped up another white collar union, or union of the Babus, as these
right.
workers would call them. And
Uh-huh.
that was more compliant, that was more easy to control for the authorities. So for 20 years, this workers' union, it mounted very militant sort of challenges to the state, and it remained unrecognized. It didn't have anything very concrete to offer the workers in terms of any kind of monetary gain or any kind of facilities, because it was unrecognized. But the workers continued to mobilize behind this union. In their
Right,
representations to the Royal Commission on Labor and at other forums, their leaders argued that what they represented was a true working class movement. And if they were not indulged, the movement would go over to extremisms of the left or the right. So either they would go over to Congress in this understanding, or they would go over to the communists. And they presented themselves as a moderate faction that was focused on workers' interests and on workers' politics. And these other groups in that argument were supposed to use them for their own political agenda, right?
right, right, right.
So,
Bi-
I mean, if you listen to the communists of that time, and if you listen to the broader sort of left wing representatives of that era, you, of course, find a dismissal of all of this. The idea is that it was purely a reformist union, and they were interested in gaining some kind of benefits, and it was an economistic movement, not a political
Right,
one. But again, this whole distinction between the economistic and the political is something that has always been contested amongst people who saw themselves as trade unionists. Hmm? So even if we go back to Robert Owen, who, of course, was not a trade unionist, because trade unions, that term didn't exist at that point, but who laid the foundation of organizations of cooperation that turned later on into trade unions. Even there, the idea was to bypass this debate of, whether the movement is focused on economic goals or political. They were one and the same.
right.
Later on, certain strains of the left assumed, along with the liberal camp, that these were distinct things. So the
Right,
broader point of this whole monograph is to be able to see trade unionism as central in terms of being an ideological repertoire, in terms of being a platform for mobilization, in terms of being an approach towards workers'
right.
solidarity, and not simply as a symptom of some kind of anti-revolutionary, anti-political, and
Hmm.
reactionary force. They were at pains to constantly tell anybody who would listen that that's
Okay.
not who we are.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, no, no, thank you so much for this really interesting and insightful background. And, as to, the purpose and the scope of your research. And certainly it's one of its kind because there's such a limited material, which I'm sure you also face the difficulty while plowing through secondary sources or what had been done earlier. So tell us a bit more about how these trade unions played an important part in the early phase of Pakistan's history, and then the sort of middle phase where you have dictatorships
Mhm.
and return to democracy. And until 1970s, when Zulfikar Ali Bhutto really, uh, charged them up and used them and leveraged them as his popular base in part. So
Absolutely.
tell us
Absolutely.
the periodic sort of shifts,
Okay.
etc.
Let me begin from the beginning. So, the first union on the railways, the first formal union on the railways, was founded by an Irishman born and raised in India, named J.B. Miller.
Yeah.
J.B. Miller mobilized workers after the First World War. Conditions were very bad economically. Inflation had shot up. Workers' wages had not kept pace. And in that environment, he was able to mobilize a lot of workers of the Northwestern Railways, which is what it was called then. And his base was in Lahore. J.B.
Hmm.
Miller had a history of being a troublemaker, the term used for him in the official records. He had incited strikes at other places earlier and had been fired from government jobs. J.B. Miller was a white, but he was not from the white oligarchy. So that is a crucial
Hmm.
distinction. The Mughal railway movement, the railway movement of Lahore, has always been led by working class people,
Right.
individuals. Huh? So J.B.
Right.
Miller was later followed by Mirza Ibrahim, who was followed by Saifur Rahman. I'll get into that later. So J.B. Miller founded this union. They mounted a very successful strike lasting 3 months in 1920, the summer of 1920. And the central demand of that strike was that the workers should be allowed to choose their leadership. They
Right.
wanted Miller. Now, the colonial state, the railway authorities were insistent that you can pick anybody who is currently employed on the railways, and we will be okay with that. But you can't pick Miller because Miller is not
Hmm.
now employed on the railways. He was earlier a guard on the railways, but at that moment he was not an employee. And they were like, he's an outsider, which is again a very important debate within labor history, within the study of labor movements, about who is an insider and who is an outsider, whether outsiders should be allowed to lead these movements, or whether that goes against proletarian autonomy and initiative. But that's a different matter. So, so what happened then is that at the conclusion of that strike, and that strike overlapped with a lot of different movements that were taking place at the time. So there was the pan-Islamic Khilafat movement. They overlapped with that. They overlapped with the Congress movement of that time, the Satyagraha movement of Gandhi. So there was a broad spectrum of ideologies that was being reflected in the labor movement. But at the same time, the labor movement, its representatives were at pains to insist that we are not identical with these movements. We can
Right.
empathize, sympathize with them, and we can sometimes join forces and ally with them. But what we are asking for is bread. So our struggle is the struggle for bread. It is the struggle for our livelihood and our dignity. It is not identical to the nationalist struggle. And we are not necessarily even against the colonial state or the white
Hmm.
man. Well, of
Hmm.
course, their leader was a white person. They sometimes marched under the Union Jack. So it was, if you look at the symbolism and the forms of protest, it was simultaneously a critique of colonialism as well as the denial of being completely under the thrall of the nationalist movement, right? So you have these contradictory tendencies within the movement, but one thing that they emphasize is that this movement is principally about workers and their livelihood. Now,
Right.
eventually, after 3 months, the railway authorities concede, and Miller is accepted as the leader of the union. Things continue for the next few years, but there is tension always. And ultimately, what happens is that the railway authorities prop up a rival union of white collar Indian workers, who these workers would, refer to as Babus, the Babu Union, and that they recognize. So then again, there is a strike in 1925 and things go on, but the union is not recognized then up till 1942.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah. Why
Okay.
is it recognized in 1942? It is recognized in 1942 because that is the moment where the colonial state is already battling on several fronts. And it is trying to rally workers that are willing to collaborate with the state. So in
Uh-huh.
that context, these workers and their unions and their organizations become palatable to the colonial state and they accept them to, and also the railway workshops can't shut down because the war effort is going on. Armaments are being produced here, and the railways is central to that war effort, or its Indian contribution at least. So then they recognize them, and that is the moment when they get recognized that their popularity starts decreasing. And by 1945, a communist worker by the name of Mirza Muhammad Ibrahim, known popularly as Baba Mazdoor Tehreek,
Yes.
and much revered even today and idolized by all strands of trade unionists. So he comes to the fore. He had been inducted into a communist study circle in the late 1930s. So there were these cells in place where what the Communist Party would do is that they would send in their students, they would send in other intellectuals who were associated to the party, and they would conduct these study circles with, isolated cells of workers. And Mirza Ibrahim was a product of that long association. He initially worked under Miller's Union, under his wing, but later on shifted to the party. And in 1946, finally, what happens is that there is again a call for a call for strike on the railways across India, and Miller's Union at that point refuses to join that call, whereas the workers are inclined to do so. Conditions, again, as they tend to be after wars, are abysmal. Workers are facing a very tough time, and there is a growing resentment amongst them. They want something to be done, and Miller and his union appear to be just standing on the sidelines, sitting on the fence, and that's not acceptable to the mood at that time. And that is when Mirza Ibrahim and his cohort of worker militants, in fact, bring the movement into the fold of the Communist Party. Again, these are not my words. This is what is written in local documentation of the Communist Party at the level of the district. उर्दू के वो
Right.
रिकॉर्ड है, उनमें ये वो पार्टी के जो रिप्रेजेंटेटिव्स हैं, जो
Right.
पॉलिटिकल कम्युनिस्ट हैं, वो ये कहते हैं कि जी हमने कुछ नहीं किया, ये जो मूवमेंट है ये हमारी झोली में ला के रखी है इन वर्कर कॉमरेड्स ने. So again, this goes against the general narrative which assumes कि जी क्या होता है कि जी आते हैं intellectuals from above and beyond, और वो आके जो है वो मार्क्सिज्म की साइंस वर्कर्स को जो है सिखाते हैं, और उसके बाद वर्कर्स जो हैं वो कन्वर्ट हो जाते हैं टू द क्रीड ऑफ कम्युनिज्म, राइट, और सोशलिज्म. बट
Right.
वो एक इसका एलिमेंट है इस कहानी का, एब्सोल्युटली, that transgressive relationship is crucial to the making of the worker militant. Absolutely crucial. But what happens after the forging of that bond is equally important.
Equally
So,
important.
so what happens is that from then on, from 46 to the 70s, early 70s, Mirza's union holds absolute power on the railways. Mirza himself gets Mirza Ibrahim Saab gets arrested right after partition. Defense of
Hmm.
India Act gets renamed into Defense of Pakistan Act, and he's thrown into the Lahore fort. And
Right.
he spends a long time in the fort, and he talks about it in his interviews. And these interviews were recorded in the twilight of his life and the final years of his life. In fact, when he's 90 years old and he's no longer relevant to contemporary labor politics, and he's
Hmm.
sick and he's dying. And these interviews are very candid in that way. there is very little censoring. There is also very little structure. It's a very stream of consciousness style of narration that we see in those interviews. They are held at the archives of South Asia Partnership in Lahore.
Oh, okay,
And
okay.
these are video interviews,
Mm-hmm.
which I have since translated and used in my work. So coming back to the point, Mirza Ibrahim then, up till the 70s, he remains with the party, a stalwart of the party, mobilizes the workers on their behalf on many occasions. When he talks about his time in the fort and his time in jail, he talks about how he would always in jail, get C class, how he would end up in the fort, how he would be tortured, and how he would suffer the brunt of the law in a way that his elite political communist comrades never did. So,
Right, right,
the
right.
fraught nature of that relationship is something that keeps coming up. Obviously,
So,
you can.
stratification within the left movement. One,
Yes.
if I were to put it like a caste or a class system, that's very interesting. Yes.
Okay, so yeah, it's very useful for me that you use the term caste because I will eventually come to that. So when they
Okay,
use
let's
the
go there.
language of caste to, talk about their experience of class, that is
Hmm.
very interesting and why they continue to do so in the Pakistani context. So anyhow, let me first finish the story
Sure,
uh,
sure,
so
sure.
so our viewers can have some kind of context and perspective. So in the 70s, what happens is that Bhutto, of course, as you earlier pointed out, he starts mobilizing the workers. He starts bringing on people like Dr. Mubashir Hassan and others who work in workers' constituencies and who contest elections from that area. And that is the first moment when Mirza Ibrahim has a problem with the communists. And he argues that, Bhutto, these people would say that, he's going to bring in socialism. I would say, no, he's not going to bring in socialism. He is a landlord himself, and he has no intention to do anything of that sort. And he says they, instead of supporting me, what they did was that they propped up Dr. Mubashir Hassan in that constituency, and he won those elections. I was sidelined. So again, the it is a refrain that you encounter in so many different theaters. If you look at the movement in Bombay at that time, you again hear this same lament by the worker militants that, whenever it came to leadership, these people would come to the front. They would promise us to support us, and when the moment came, they would take over the reins. And that is for the workers disingenuous. That is something that is dishonest and is not done with comrades. So anyhow, he breaks away from the party then, and he remains active in workers' politics in Mughalpura. In fact, there is a strike right after the elections, and Dr. Mubashir Hassan goes to mediate. And the workers tell him that, listen, we voted for you. That's all well and good. But when it comes to the union and matters of work, we only look to Mirza Sahab. So this is not your domain. So again, it was strategic, the alliance, it was something that allowed the workers to finally be able to escape the isolation that they were in for so long. Because as long as they were with the communists, nobody was listening to them, of course. The
Right,
state
right.
was completely oblivious, and except when it cracked down on them, which it did very frequently. So that is where Mirza broke away from the party. In the late 70s, early 80s, the party then propped up another of its worker militants, again recruited in the same way. Mirza
Right.
was a fitter in the workshops. J.B. Miller was a guard on the railways. Saifur Rahman, who replaced Mirza Ibrahim, was also a fitter in the railways. So these were all
Mm-hmm.
working class people. And Saifur Rahman again was recruited by the party. According to him, he was recruited because he was very brave, and he was fearless and in the face of oppression, and he was very committed to the party. And he was recruited then, and he was propped up against Mirza Ibrahim. I interviewed Saifur Rahman about 5, 6 years ago, just before the book came out, and I had to make many changes in light of what I heard there. For the better, I think, but who knows? But Saifur Rahman told me then. So initially, of course, I met him with radical bourgeois intellectual of the left, somebody who was in the professors group, who also happens to be a mentor of mine. And these old hands
Ahmed,
from the
your formulations are just amazing. Radical bush.
yeah, no, no. So these
I'm
transgressive
also on
bourgeoisie.
my armchair, and instead of champagne, I have green tea. So that's the
Thank you
difference.
for clarifying that. We could end up in trouble otherwise. But
Hmm.
um, but yeah. So Saifur Rahman then he initially, of course, he was a bit reluctant to open up, to be very candid about his experience in the party and his experiences since the party completely disbanded and moved away from trade union politics. So eventually when he opened up, he said certain things which bring me back to your comment about caste and class. So this working class comrade again, who worked with the party, who mobilized workers, who knew for a fact that he could do anything that any of his intellectual comrades could do, and that the distinction between the intellectual and manual workers of revolution was one that was rather a matter of history and privilege and accident than anything else. He tells
Yes.
you that, you know, I was always telling these people, I was saying, I have these daughters, and he gets very personal there. And they were good girls. They knew how to take care of the house, and they were, very just generally very good. And I asked all my comrades in the party, and I said, find me a good match. It doesn't have to be rich or anything, but just has to be a comrade. But
Hmm.
they nobody came forward. Then he says that, in it, at some point he says, we people, we are like their majawar. These are people who take care of the shrines, who sweep the floors, and who clean the
Yes.
gutters. And so the analogy being drawn, the metaphor is that of the intellectuals as the gaddi nashin, as the ones who are entitled to privilege to just intellectual labor, and then people like me who are supposed to go and get
Hmm.
beat
Very
up
interesting. Very
and do the
interesting.
manual work of revolution.
Yeah.
This is how also, so see, you see, not marrying each other, not forming relationships. As Mirza said, that these people were elite people in Pakistan. He uses the term khandani. He says
Khandan.
nawabs. He says in India the party was a party of middle class people, of the
That's
bourgeoisie.
right.
And he says here these people were the absolute elite. And I would go there, and I am from, Killa Gujar Khan, and I am a rustic person. I would spit everywhere I would go.
Killa Gujar
Killa
Singh, I
Gujar
think.
Singh. हाँ,
Ah.
Killa Gujar Singh. हाँ. Yeah. So, Dada Ibrahim, no, not Ibrahim, Dada Amir Haider was also from Killa
Yes.
Gujar Khan, another towering figure in left politics.
Correct.
Yeah. So he says that I would do these things and I was uncultured. He uses that term.
Hmm.
But these people were cultured and they would laugh at me. I knew it. But what could I do? These are my habits. This is who I am. And then he says, well, this has to stop for the party to actually mean something. So you see, all these things keep coming up. कि जी ये नवाब थे, ये खानदानी थे, हम इनके मजावर थे, हमसे शादियां नहीं करते थे. This is the language of caste exclusion before anything else.
So
Okay.
interesting.
Yeah.
So interesting.
So they use this, and we can only avoid it at our own peril. तो
Yeah.
ये कुछ फ्रैगमेंट्स हैं इनकी ओरल इंटरव्यूज के, जो कंप्लीटली हमें एक तरह से रिकंसिडर करने को मजबूर करते हैं उस टेलियोलॉजी को जो हम सारे जो है लेके चलते हैं हमेशा, कि
We,
क्या
yes.
होगा, the elite intellectual comrade would descend, come down to the
Mm,
level of the worker, and
mm, mm,
uplift the worker through the science of communism.
mm,
All of
mm,
these people would say that we still believe in communism. Mirza, as he put it, he says, Mera iman aaj bhi hai socialism, communism. Saifur Rahman will still tell you that that is the only way forward. But the the actual sort of experience of the party is not that. Education within the party was supposed to it the party was supposed to be demonstrative. It was supposed to level these hierarchies within itself. It was not meant to be a school in a traditional sense for these workers. It
mm.
was meant to enact the solidarity and the egalitarianism and the equality that it talked about. And that is
Right,
exactly the domain where repeatedly the party seems to have come short for these worker militants. At the
right.
end of that journey, they all end up saying that there are certain things only the intellectuals can do. I cannot make the party line, they say. That has to come from them. I can get my head crushed. I can get my neck chopped off on the guillotine. And these are the terms they're using. So it is like
Yes,
all we
yes.
have to give is the annihilation of our bodies. That's what we are
Mm,
reduced to, our bodies,
mm,
our labor. So you see, if after being in the party for so many decades, you reach the conclusion that there are certain things that certain intellectuals can do, and then there are those things that you, as manual laborers, are supposed to, um, be doing, then the party has failed in the task of intellectual emancipation. And my broader argument increasingly is going towards, I'm going towards workers' education. I published something on that a couple of years ago. There is more forthcoming, where the argument is something like, it is not the fact that despite an education in Marxist theory or Marxist ideology, these workers have remained divided, and they have remained, confined to trade unionism or whatever you want to call it. It is that perhaps that education, instead of emancipating people, these working militants, is in fact stultifying them, which of course is an argument that you can make also about education in general. And I draw upon the work of Roncière, this French philosopher, and Alfred Sohn Retzel, who was a German revisionist Marxist, and a few others when I say that. So that is
Right.
the broad sort of
Very,
lesson that I
very interesting. And I wish, that we had a longer time to go and delve further into many of the sort of dimensions of your scholarship. But let's come to the post, which I'm sure, it's kind of out of purview of your writing, but I'm sure you're working on it. So, tell the viewers and those who are going to listen to this as to what happened to this trade unionism and the movement after the 70s, of course, General Ziaul Haq and post Zia era, and where it stands today.
Okay. Like you mentioned, I'm not very intimately familiar with those events.
Hmm.
More broadly, I can say a few things because I have been interacting with these people as part of my research, which deals with an earlier period. So my understanding, which I get from these people, is that it wasn't repression which killed the movement. In fact, if you talk to these people, it was precisely the moments of intense repression where there was greatest solidarity, which is
Hmm.
not counterintuitive if you think about it. And,
Right.
Saifur Rahman talks about the movement for restoration of democracy, and he talks about how, there was this wonderful sort of, phase in worker and intellectual solidarity at that time, where the professors would go to the workers and they would mobilize them, and there would be a lot of collaboration, and there was a lot of fervor in the movement. So Zia didn't kill the unions. He did not kill the spirit of trade
Yes.
unionism. That's not true. What happens is that with the fall of the Berlin Wall and with the left itself, many of the old leftists themselves moving away from, their earlier positions and embracing, ideologies, let's say, which they would previously not be open to. That is
Correct.
where that solidarity begins to fracture. So
Hmm.
that older intellectual left, that older left, in fact, fractures very seriously at this level.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah, yeah. It is in fact a dismantling of the left from within, the exodus of several leftists themselves from an older mode of left politics, a move away from the ideology of trade unionism or militant workers' politics itself, which in fact, can better explain this kind of sudden collapse. And it was
Right.
sudden. यू नो अगर वो वर्कर से आप पूछें तो वो यही वो बफर से बार बार वो कहते हैं कि हम तो खड़े थे, हमने कहा कि आप आए हमारा साथ दें, रेवोल्यूशन लेके आते हैं, ये कहते थे कि नहीं, ये वो टाइम नहीं है. Saifur
Right.
Rahman would put it in this way. He was like, I would go to them and I would ask them to, let's reignite the struggle, and they would argue that this is not the time for that anymore. So
Yes.
it was an abandonment of that earlier project. It was a realization, perhaps, an honest realization on the parts of many on the left, of course, their rational analysis, which led them to believe that this is not on the horizon anymore. This is
Hmm.
neither possible nor maybe even desirable, and maybe we
Right. Right.
need
Right.
to rethink older modes of left mobilization and politics. मैं खुद उसको क्रिटिक करता रहा हूँ अभी पिछले आधे घंटे से, उस मोड को और उसकी कुछ टेंडेंसीज को. सो आई एम नॉट गोइंग टू से कि नहीं, ऐसे उसमें बिल्कुल ही कोई बात नहीं है.
Right.
उसमें
Right. Right.
जाहिर है कोई बात है. वो जो ओल्ड एक लेफ्ट की पॉलिटिक्स थी, उसमें उसके अपने ब्लाइंड स्पॉट्स थे, उसके अपने इश्यूज थे. बट दिस इज माय अंडरस्टैंडिंग के लेफ्ट के अंदर भी जो है एक मूवमेंट थी जिसमें ये डिसाइडेड नहीं था कि अ, आगे क्या होना है. और वो उससे अभी तक वो जो लेफ्ट है वो रिकवर नहीं कर सका पूरी तरह, जैसे वो वेस्ट में नहीं कर सका.
नहीं कर सके जी, अभी तक नहीं कर सके.
जी.
यू वेरी राइट अबाउट दिस,
तो आई
एब्सोल्युटली.
थिंक इट इज समथिंग दैट पैरेलल्स दैट सिचुएशन. और
करेक्ट.
आज अगर ट्रेड यूनियनिज्म जो है तो उसमें वही रेमनेंट्स हैं. बशीर अहमद बख्तियार साहब थे, उन्होंने उसी वक्त करियर शुरू किया 1930s में अमृतसर से. बाद में वो जो है वो जो फेडरेशन ऑफ लेबर थी, जो गवर्नमेंट के साथ, पाकिस्तानी गवर्नमेंट के साथ मिलके काम करती थी, वो उसमें चले गए. और मिर्जा इब्राहिम साहब जो थे वो उस फेडरेशन में चले गए जो कि गवर्नमेंट को बिल्कुल नागवार थी. तो वो दोनों
हाँ.
बन गए एक तरह से एक फेस, वन ऑफ रेवोल्यूशनरी वर्कर्स पॉलिटिक्स एंड अदर ऑफ रिफॉर्मिस्ट वर्कर्स पॉलिटिक्स. लेकिन वो भी जो categorization, it falls apart when you look at the movements that they led. So अयूब खान को जब हटाना था तो तब तो वो दोनों एक प्लेटफॉर्म पे थे.
एक ही प्लेटफॉर्म पे थे, बिल्कुल बिल्कुल,
इसी तरह
एब्सोल्युटली.
दोनों की शुरुआत तो एक ही थी. दोनों को तो जो है एजुकेट, वो तो पार्टी के लोगों ने किया था, वो तो लेफ्ट के लोगों ने किया था. दोनों कहते
बिल्कुल.
थे कि सोशलिज्म जो है वो ही है रास्ता. दोनों सोशलिज्म के जो आइडियोलॉजिकल और सिंबॉलिक रेपर्टवार है उसको इस्तेमाल करते थे. तो
बिल्कुल.
बहरहाल,
बिल्कुल.
तो आज अगर ट्रेड यूनियनिज्म है वहां और उसकी कोई एक्चुअल इंस्टीट्यूशनल प्रेजेंस है, अगर मैं सिर्फ लाहौर की बात करूं जिससे मैं ज्यादा वाकिफ हूं, तो वो आपको नजर आती है वही बशीर बख्तियार साहब का जो लेबर हॉल है लाहौर में, जिसमें
करेक्ट.
खुर्शीद अहमद खान साहब आज बैठते हैं. तो
करेक्ट. करेक्ट.
वो ही होता है सेंटर पे और फोर फ्रंट पे अभी भी इन स्ट्रगल्स के. लेकिन बहुत जो है रिप्रेशन के थ्रू और इंटरनल फ्रैक्चरिंग के थ्रू इन इन मूवमेंट्स को तोड़ा गया है ओवर टाइम. और अब जो प्राइवेट पब्लिक सेक्टर की यूनियंस हैं वो इफेक्टिव नहीं रही उस तरह से. उसके रीजंस, जैसा मैं
राइट.
अभी
राइट.
तक इंसिस्ट कर रहा हूँ, वो इंटरनल भी हैं टू लेफ्ट पॉलिटिक्स, टू वर्कर्स पॉलिटिक्स, और वो एक्सटर्नल भी हैं. एंड नाइदर
राइट.
कैन स्टैंड इन फॉर एन एक्सप्लेनेशन ऑन इट्स ओन.
Right. Bilkul. Ahmed, this was such a fascinating conversation. And, I just feel that, you've opened the doors for so many other potential future discussions, particularly on the inner workings of the left and the various dilemmas that they've undergone. And of course, and what is the status or the future of left politics in Pakistan, because trade unionism is the core of that whole imaginary. So, but we'll have to end here because we'll keep something for the upcoming interactions whenever you have time. But thank you so much for being with us, and thank
Oh,
you.
thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you
goodbye.
for hosting me.
Yeah,
People generally are not interested in this theme, so I would love the opportunity to be heard by a larger audience. Thank you.
we shall do that. Thank you
Thank
and
you very
goodbye.
much.